Students, welcome once again to another in our series of video lectures in the Humanities 232 class. I'm your instructor, Dr. Barry Graham. We want to look at this time at the early Renaissance. Renaissance, of course, being the rebirth, this rediscovery of classical learning that we've talked about at some point in the past. This, of course, is chapter 12 out of the Culture and Values 8th edition. We want to start with Lorenzo il Magnifico, which of course is the magnificent Lorenzo. None of these rulers were humble about their names. But if anyone deserves such a title, Lorenzo would come pretty close because the Medici family, of which he was one and the first of the great Medici rulers during the Renaissance, certainly accomplished quite a bit. As you can see here, he was not only an accomplished vernacular poet, vernacular meaning he wrote in the common language of the day, he was also the very rich patron of Ficino, Botticelli, and Michelangelo, among many, many others. And this is the way that the Medici family did achieve greatness in terms of not only being rulers, but they started the modern day banking system. They were basically able to buy their way into power. It's not that they were from a royal family the way many in the past would have secured the throne. They were rich. And so Laurentian patronage of learning meant that he was from this line that would fund these artists during this day. And so he had a great deal to do with the founding of the University of Pisa. You've perhaps heard of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, one of the great landmarks that exists even in our world today. The Stadium of Florence, and by the way, much of this that we'll be talking about in this chapter will be situated in the Italian city of Florence. I mentioned that this was a time of the rediscovery of classical learning. By classical learning, we're talking about the Greco Roman culture. Greek was looked at as an export from Florence since they were the ones that led this great movement in rediscovering classical learning. We mentioned that Lorenzo was the one who funded many of these great artists like Botticelli. We'll look at Botticelli's works like his La Primavera, which means springtime, and also his Birth of Venus. As we look at these works, we'll notice that it really captured a Platonic idealism combined interestingly with Christian mysticism. So there was a synchronism, is the word we'll want to use here, in terms of combining what originally would have been called pagan learning and, interestingly, Christian learning. He was a great patron of one of the most famous artists of all time, Leonardo da Vinci, and Da Vinci was not only a great artist, he was possibly one of the most talented people who ever lived. He was a scientist, he was an engineer, he was an artist, he was a sculptor, you name it, and Leonardo could do it. One of those people in history who's so famous we actually even know him by his first name. And if that sounds like one of the names of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, that's because whether you knew it or not, all four Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were named for Renaissance artists. And I think you'll see that as we go along. Some of Leonardo's works were the famous Mona Lisa, The Last Supper, the Madonna of the Rocks. Leonardo was known for keeping very meticulous notebooks, and some of those notebooks survive unto this day, believe it or not. And this is how we have notes on some of his famous inventions, and some of the inventions that didn't make it to fruition were invented later. Leonardo had a plan for an airplane, he had a plan for a helicopter. In fact, many have speculated that if there had been the money to go through with some of these inventions, the things like the airplane and the helicopter may have actually been invented 300 years early in history. That's how brilliant he was. He was also an expert in mathematics. He studied the natural world and humanity. And being an artist, he did it for aesthetics, also, not just for science, and for a love of beauty. We mentioned Botticelli's works. Here his famous La Primavera, the springtime. In this work, you'll of course see the pagan symbolism, the Neoplatonic idealism, and there's this idea of ideal feminine beauty. And as you can see, this is not the same over the years. What we might consider the ideal female form today is different from what they would have thought back then. And just even a casual look at this painting reveals that. You also see it here in the famous Birth of Venus, Venus being one of the ancient Roman goddesses, and this shows her being born full grown out of a seashell, and you see the various Greek and Roman elements in the painting. It's obviously an allegorical work. Ideal feminine beauty is emphasized in these works, as it is also in Leonardo's Mona Lisa. This is perhaps the most famous painting of all time. Even if you're not well versed in the arts and things of that nature, most people have heard of the Mona Lisa. She has this very wry smile. Nobody knows who the model was for this. Some have even speculated it was Leonardo himself, and he just made himself look like a female. We certainly don't know that for sure. Why is she smiling with her mouth closed? Remember, this is in a day in history when dental work was virtually unknown. Most people's teeth would rot out pretty quick. She probably had dentures, and back then all they had was wooden dentures. So their teeth would not look very attractive. We take modern dentistry for granted. They didn't have that back then. Here is Leonardo's equally famous The Last Supper. If you saw any of the Da Vinci Code movies in the past or heard of the books, of course, this plays an intricate part in the movie. I won't get into all of that because I don't buy into the novelist Brown's ideas. They're not based on good scholarship, but that's another subject. We can see the emotions here. The apostles are all arranged in four distinct groups. There's a mathematical symmetry to it. As we mentioned earlier, Leonardo was a mathematical master. Below Christ, there's actually a doorway that's cut here. This was cut by Napoleon's soldiers way back in the day when they were using the monastery as a military headquarters. Interestingly, this Lord's Supper has been restored in recent years, and here is actually a digital restoration. They've actually taken a picture of it and digitally restored it even to a greater degree. And so you can see the apostles all reacting in astoundment with Jesus saying, "One of you is going to betray me." And they're saying, "Surely not I, Lord." And if you're familiar with the biblical story, you of course know what I'm talking about. Here is the Madonna of the Rocks, another painting by Leonardo. It was never completed. It was intended to be a part of a large altarpiece. You can, of course, see John the Baptist and Jesus and Mary, her sister, as well. You can also see a cave, and the cave is very significant because it can symbolize both where Jesus was born, being born in basically a place where they kept animals back then, and also the place where he would eventually be buried in his adulthood. Continuing with this Medici era that we've been discussing, we see the equally famous Michelangelo Buonarroti in his cameo carving the Madonna of the Stairs. We see something that's very indicative of his particular style, his Pietà, much more famous even than the Madonna of the Stairs. But the most famous of all is probably his David. Now it's interesting here. Every Renaissance artist sculpted a David. Anybody who sculpted would do a David because David is the classic underdog who overcomes adversity. This is a good subject matter to symbolize what the artist wants to communicate there. His particular David is a statement of idealized beauty, and it to this day is in the Palazzo Vecchio, which is a symbol of civic power, the power of the city of Florence. Palazzo is just Italian for palace. Here we see the very famous David. Now, you may wonder, why would they sculpt him without any clothes? There was a reason for this, and it had nothing to do with what we would call pornography today. It had to do with the fact that, again, there's a great Greco Roman influence here. And during Greek times in the Olympic Games, all male athletes, and there were only male athletes, there were no female athletes at that time that competed, they all competed in the nude. And this was so the judges could judge their form as well as whether they actually won the race or ran faster than somebody else. It was very, very important how well you looked in doing it. This is why David is depicted in this way. It's intended to be viewed from below. That's why it's up on a pedestal even to this day. And the weight is supported on its right leg here by this tree trunk. Very clever the way he worked that in to the sculpture, because there had to be some way to support the great weight of these. He did it in such a way that it just blends in and it's more camouflaged into the work. Another interesting individual, this is not so much of an artist, but is the Fra Savonarola. You see the years that he lived there. He was a Dominican preacher and a reformer, and he epitomized this idea of the Laurentian Florence versus medieval piety. He was a doomsday preacher, basically, advocating a very pious lifestyle. He inspired many converts during the course of his life. He had a huge following, even though most of those fell off towards the end of his life. And he defied excommunication from the Pope, from the leaders of the Catholic Church during this time, and they executed him. They burned him at the stake along with two or three of his other followers. And it was a very, very gruesome death, as you can imagine. So he was advocating things that, on the surface, I think we would all say were really good. He denounced the corruption that he saw within the Catholic Church, the idea of they were exploiting the poor. He actually prophesied the coming of a new biblical flood, and all of this actually predicted the eventual rise of the Reformation movement that we see later with Martin Luther and Zwingli and Calvin and many of those. So he's actually a forerunner, but as we know, many times if you're running too ahead of the curve, the time is not right for it and you end up suffering. And of course, he did, being burned at the stake. But a very interesting historical figure. We want to transition now to talk about the character of the Renaissance, the characteristics of the Renaissance, so to speak. And it's very hard to actually put your finger on the starting point of the Renaissance. It's not like they just woke up one day and said, oh boy, today the Renaissance starts. Everything in history is a process, and we put these kind of labels on them retroactively after the fact. Historians like Jules Michelet, Jacob Burckhardt, and Charles Homer Haskins all differ in their opinions on this. But the characteristics of the Renaissance include things like the artist as an individual, an individualistic spirit seeking fame and fortune, humanism, a new term here, as an outgrowth of this classical learning, this rediscovery of the Greek and Roman works. And then finally, the advancement of self and society through intellectual efforts. So, a great emphasis on the intellectual aspect of all of this as well. Pico della Mirandola, when Mirandola met Lorenzo and another artist and writer by the name of Ficino, it drastically changed his life. These were life-changing events for him. And so when he came to Florence in somewhere around November of 1484, and he met these two individuals, this was the day that Ficino had chosen to publish his translations of the works of Plato from Greek into Latin so that it could be understood by the scholars of that day. And so when he came under Lorenzo's patronage, when Lorenzo started funding his career, Pico made a great impression on both of them. And that's how he achieved that patronage and friendship with Ficino. And even though there were some differences, Mirandola was influenced by them. And Lorenzo would end up supporting both of them and protecting them. Pico specifically until his death in 1492. Without Lorenzo's support, it's doubtful that Pico would have survived the eventual Inquisition that the Catholic Church conducted later, looking for heretics and persecuting them and all of the tragedies that happened with that. But there was really a synthesis of all learning here and the idea that that would eventually lead one to truth. And so he was a student of all the languages and cultures, as we've mentioned. His most famous book or work was the Oration on the Dignity of Man, the themes being man bridges the gap between heaven and creation, and that just humanity itself is a great miracle when you think about it. We can probably all agree with that. Then we have individuals like Johann Reuchlin, who promoted biblical studies in their original languages. Of course, that would be Hebrew for the Old Testament and the Greek, specifically the Koine Greek, for the New Testament. And as we mentioned earlier, this does pave the way for the later reformers in the Reformation movement, people like Martin Luther and many, many others that question the abuses in the Catholic Church and eventually break off. One of the great technological advancements was, of course, the printing press. The printing press is probably very similar to the invention of the computer later in history, and it had a very similar impact as far as getting information out into a given culture. So, with people like Aldus Manutius, the humanists began to collect and correct some of these old manuscripts from the Greeks and the Romans, and even ancient copies of the Bible. And there's a vast scope of Greek and Latin and vernacular text. Again, by vernacular, we're just meaning the common language of the day, whether it be Italian if you're living in Italy or German if you're living in Germany, and you get the idea there. The person who is credited, even though there's some debate about this in history, with the invention of the printing press is Johann Gutenberg. You've perhaps heard of the Gutenberg Bible because that was the first thing ever printed on the printing press. Another significant individual was William Claxton, who was an English merchant and a diplomat and a writer, and he was thought to be the first person to introduce a printing press into England in the year 1476, and as a printer was the first English retailer of printed books. He was the first one to sell them. And so he's a very significant individual in terms of the impact that he had. With this print technology, came a great diffusion of ideas. For instance, there were 6 to 9 million books and 13,000 different editions in place by 1500. If you go back and you look at the years that Gutenberg lived, and about the time of the invention of the printing press within those years, within a period of about 50 years or so or less, we have lots and lots of books being printed and being distributed throughout the Renaissance culture here, especially Western Europe. Women, believe it or not, even though they are still considered second class citizens during this period in history, there are women who do make an impact during the Renaissance. And this is because of the humanist idea that they really prize education. Even if you were a woman, if you were from a rich family, an aristocratic family, let's say, you could get something in the way of an education because these families saw education as a priority. That was one of the hallmarks of being rich, and the way that you showed that you were rich is that you were educated. With the rise of the printing press and greater accessibility to books, we begin to see some women writers. And again, these are just in the upper class culture, or they were women who were nuns, women who were involved in the convent lifestyle because they would still receive an education. And believe it or not, women were criticized for not following traditional societal roles. In some ways, that's no different from even today, and I'm sure the ladies that are watching this video presentation would no doubt agree with me. Another interesting individual, Niccolo Machiavelli. I find him fascinating. His classic work was called The Prince, or The Technique of the Ruling Power. It's really a secular study of political theory and how one rises to power and not only seizes power, but keeps power. The way to do that. Much of the writings during this period in history are about the idea of utopia. How do you achieve an ideal culture and how do you keep it that way? So he's inspired by the writings that still existed from the Roman Empire, from Republican Rome. And even though many people would question whether that was an ideal society, it certainly wasn't. He still received some inspiration from that. There's a realistic pragmatism here. Pragmatism just meaning practical. Success, he would say, in governing is key to power. Wisdom combined, believe it or not, with ruthlessness. He held that Christianity's role in politics had been disastrous over the centuries. But the classic term, even though he didn't say it in so many words that you still hear today, that we see in Machiavelli's work, specifically The Prince here, was that the end justifies the means. Anything that the ruler needs to do to seize power and keep power is justified. And so, if that means you got to be ruthless, try to do it all in the beginning, get it all out of the way quickly, so that then you can begin to grant favors to the people and gain their trust and make them like you, so to speak, because of that. It was said that Hitler, Mussolini, many others in history read The Prince and were inspired by them, even though it would probably be unfair to blame Machiavelli for all of their abuses. Another individual, Erasmus. Again, a fascinating individual in history. He was a wandering scholar, an author, and founder of what we would call today Christian humanism. Those two terms may not seem to go along with each other. They certainly wouldn't today, the way we define humanism, but they defined it a little bit differently. With them, it was just an emphasis on being human. And it's here that we should stress that during the Renaissance, the emphasis was on the here and now. Whereas in the medieval or the Middle Ages, before this period, the emphasis was always on God. It was a very God centered culture. And so the emphasis would, of course, be on just this world is not my home. I'm just passing through, like the old hymn says. And so we're waiting for heaven before we can have the real party. They would say, well, heaven's good and everything, but we can also appreciate this present earthly life that we have. So he combined this classical learning with Christian living. His classic work was called The Praise of Folly. You can Google this work and you don't have to pay a penny for it because it's in the public domain, which means nobody can copyright it. Folly is personified in this book as a woman. And so he's having this conversation with Folly. It attacked the religious corruption of the day, again, very similar to the reformers, what the reformers would do later on, actually concurrently with Erasmus, because he actually lived during the Protestant Reformation. And there was a sweeping social criticism of the society of the day. His work, The Praise of Folly, believe it or not, was outsold only by the Bible in the 16th century. Not only that, this is not really emphasized so much in your textbook, but I think it should be, is that Erasmus was the one most responsible for the King James Bible. Why is that? It's because Erasmus, like many of these other scholars, was collecting these old Greek texts. As he did that, he began to make translations directly from the Greek into the current language, into Latin, into the vernacular languages of the day. And that became the basis for what we call the Textus Receptus, or the received text, that scholars used later to make the first English translation of the Bible, which of course we call the King James Version. Now, because of that, the version is not very good. I'm not saying that to put down the King James Bible. It's still a monument to the English language and still has some very, very positive qualities to it. But the reason why I say the translation is not very good is because Erasmus didn't have access to that many Greek texts. The English translations we have today are much better than the King James Bible, not just because it brings them into a more modern form of English, but because we have access to many, many more copies of the Greek New Testament than Erasmus ever had. We'll now transition to music in the 15th century during the early Renaissance. And this will be our final slide. We talk about musicians like Guillaume Dufay. He really secularized the motet, which was previously more of a sacred piece of music. By sacred, we mean music that's performed in a church service. And the songs of the masses, things of this nature. If you were a composer back then, you composed for both the church and quote unquote secular songs, music outside the church. But what he did is he brought together a synthesis of many of these styles, a synthesis, as it says here, of secular and religious music. So we begin to see some overlap here. You take a song that was used in church and then you change the words and make a secular song out of it. In the same way, you'd hear some songs out there on the street that were secular songs. He took them, brought them into the church, the tunes I'm talking about, and then just would put the religious text to it. Another individual, Johannes Ockingham, he brought a classical balance of intellect and emotion to music. So music in Medici, Florence, really had no classical models. And the reason for this is we just don't have any existing copies of ancient Greek or Roman music. What we do have is very, very scant. It might have survived engraved on some tombstones and things of this nature, but we just don't have a lot of it. But there is intellectually a great Platonic and Aristotelian significance that was brought into it, at least from that intellectual standpoint. In the various songs that are being composed, the Fritola, the Canto Carnelicesco, we see it. And again, this just gives you a basic introduction to it. On Schoology, in this topic, you'll notice that I have at least two, if not more, videos available to you to watch that really go much more into depth on this, and I encourage you to do so. That is all for Chapter 12. We'll see you next time for Chapter 13.